Once upon a time in the history of the Old West, a storm was brewing across the Texas frontier. Not from nature, but from the most fearsome horsemen to roam the Great Plains, the Comanche. These warriors were unmatched on horseback and feared by European settlers and rival tribes for their speed, precision, and sheer brutality. In one of the most devastating and unforgettable attacks in Texas history, they launched what would become known as the Great Comanche Raid. This wasn't just random violence. The Comanche raided with strategy and purpose, striking to secure resources, territory, and captives. What made them truly terrifying was the chaos they could unleash in mere hours. Whole towns wiped out, homes burned to the ground, and survivors left with nothing but the horror they barely escaped. This was more than a land battle. It was a brutal clash of cultures. Fierce warriors fighting to hold on to land they had dominated for centuries. For settlers caught in their path, the fear of a Comanche raid was a constant nightmare, lurking just beyond the horizon. In this video, we explore why Comanche war raids were so terrifying. Masters of the horse, the Comanche were unrivaled horsemen. We must start here to understand why their raids were so terrifying. The horse was central to their entire way of life. Before the arrival of horses, they were feet-bound hunters. But once they adopted the horse in the early 1700s, everything changed. They didn't just ride horses. They became one with them. Imagine a group of warriors who could fire arrows while riding at full speed, controlling their mounts with their knees. They could quickly execute sharp turns, close distances, and disappear into the horizon before anyone knew what hit them. This gave them an almost supernatural level of mobility and speed in battle. For settlers or opposing tribes, it must have been like facing a whirlwind. 1 minute, everything was calm, and the next, they were surrounded by warriors who seemed to come out of nowhere. No walls, no barricades could keep them out, and no one could outrun them. Psychological warfare, the Comanche didn't just fight physical battles. They waged psychological warfare with terrifying effectiveness. They understood that instilling fear in their enemies could often be more destructive than any physical attack. Their raids weren't just about taking land or resources and sending a chilling message to anyone who might oppose them. The unpredictability of their attacks kept settlers and rival tribes in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing when or where the next blow would come. The Comanche would use brutal tactics to ensure that their name alone was enough to strike fear into the hearts of settlers. One of their most infamous practices was the mutilation of enemies, leaving behind grotesque scenes that acted as warning. The deliberate display of brutality, whether through scalping, mutilation, or even burning, ensured that survivors would tell tales of their horror, amplifying the Comanche's reputation. This wasn't done out of simple cruelty, but was a calculated tactic to discourage resistance. They could avoid prolonged battles and sieges by mentally breaking their enemies, knowing that fear would force them to flee or surrender long before a fight began. In addition to their physical brutality, the Comanche were strategic in their use of captives. Male captives were often subjected to torturous deaths, reinforcing their image as ruthless warriors. The treatment of women and children, however, varied. Some were taken as slaves, while others, particularly children, were adopted into the tribe and raised as Comanche. This unpredictability, never knowing what fate awaited captives, further contributed to the psychological toll of a Comanche raid. Settlers knew that, if captured, they could be killed, tortured, or integrated into the tribe, never to see their families again. This constant uncertainty and dread were key components of the psychological warfare the Comanche perfected. The fear the Comanche instilled wasn't just limited to individuals or small groups. It permeated entire communities. Word of their raids spread quickly, and settlers would often abandon their homes at the mere rumor of Comanche activity in the area. Their ability to control, not just through physical dominance, but through psychological terror, made them one of the most formidable forces on the frontier. For those living in Comanche territory, the true terror was knowing that no matter how many raids survived, the Comanche could always strike again with even greater ferocity. One of the most potent weapons in the Comanche arsenal was their mastery of the element of surprise. They didn't just rely on brute force. They employed stealth, cunning, and unpredictability to strike fear into their enemy. The Comanche understood that the fear of not knowing when or where they would strike next could paralyze entire communities, making it nearly impossible for their enemies to prepare an adequate defense. This surprise tactic allowed them to maintain the upper hand, even when facing more heavily armed or organized opponents. Unlike the formalized warfare of European armies or the U.S. cavalry, the Comanche had no set time or place for their attack. They would strike at the most unexpected moments, often when their enemies were most vulnerable, at dawn, under cover of night, or during times of peace, when defenses were down. This unpredictability kept their enemies on edge, never knowing when the next attack might come. Settlers constantly feared a Comanche raid, knowing that the slightest lapse in vigilance could lead to disaster. The Comanche were also masters of using the terrain to their advantage, moving silently and swiftly through the plains. Their intimate knowledge of the land allowed them to approach settlements without detection, launching sudden attacks that left their enemies scrambling. It was often too late when a village or settlement realized they were under attack. The Comanche would descend like a storm, creating chaos and destruction, before disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. The element of surprise wasn't just about catching their enemies off guard. It was about creating an environment of fear and helplessness. The knowledge that the Comanche could strike at any moment without warning left settlers and rival tribes in a perpetual state of anxiety. This fear was a powerful weapon, allowing the Comanche to control vast territories without constant warfare. Their ability to harness the element of surprise made them one of the most feared and respected forces on the Great Plains, ensuring their enemies always looked over their shoulders, never knowing when the next attack would come. A culture built for war. The Comanche weren't just raiders. They were a society built around warfare. From a young age, boys were trained to become warriors. They learned to ride, shoot arrows with deadly precision, and hunt. By the time they were adults, they were already seasoned in battle. But it wasn't just about physical training. Comanche culture emphasized courage, bravery, and striking fear into their enemies. Warriors earned respect through their deeds in battle, and the most successful raids were celebrated. Settlers and rival tribes were up against not just individuals, but an entire culture that glorified war. Every encounter with the Comanche tested strength, endurance, and willpower. And because the Comanche were always looking for opportunities to prove themselves, no one was ever truly safe from their raids. A strategic network of alliances. The Comanche were not isolated raiders, but part of a vast network of alliances and trade. They maintained relationships with other Native American tribes, European settlers, and traders. These alliances gave them access to weapons, horses, and information, making them even more formidable. This network also meant that the Comanche could strike across a wide range of territory. They weren't limited to their lands, but could raid deep into enemy territory with the support of their allies. For their enemies, this meant that the Comanche could appear anywhere, at any time, with little warning. This combination of alliances, trade, and mobility made them one of the most feared forces in the American West. Their reach extended far beyond their traditional homeland, and no one was out of their grasp. Captivity and enslavement. One of the most terrifying aspects of Comanche raids was their practice of taking captives. Women and children were often taken alive, not just as a form of plunder, but to be integrated into Comanche society as slaves or concubines. Some captives were eventually adopted into the tribe, but many lived their lives in servitude. The idea of being captured and enslaved by the Comanche was a fate worse than death for many settlers. It wasn't just about the physical suffering, but the complete loss of autonomy. Captives were often forced to watch their families be tortured or killed, and they knew that their own lives were completely at the mercy of their captors. For those who did survive captivity, the trauma of the experience often haunted them for the rest of their lives. The stories of these captives spread fear far and wide, further cementing the Comanche's reputation as terrifying raiders. The Great Comanche Raid of 1841, the most infamous events in Comanche history, was the Great Raid of 1840, which cemented their reputation as one of the most fearsome forces in the American West. In the summer of that year, the Comanche launched a massive and coordinated attack on the heart of Texas, targeting both settlers and towns in a bold display of their power. This raid wasn't just a typical hit-and-run raid. It was a well-planned and executed assault on the growing Texan settlements that had been encroaching on Comanche land. The raid began as retaliation for the Council House fight, an event in which several Comanche chiefs were killed during what was supposed to be a peace negotiation with Texan officials. Angered by what they saw as a betrayal, the Comanche gathered a large war party, numbering in the hundreds, and set out to exact revenge. Their target, the town of Linville, one of the largest and most prosperous settlements in Texas at the time. The Comanche struck with devastating precision, catching the town completely off guard. They swept through Linville, burning homes, looting stores, and taking captive. The town was left in ruins, and many of its residents were either killed or taken prisoner. The raid continued as the Comanche moved south, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. The sheer scale and brutality of the raid shocked both Texans and the U.S. government, who realized that the Comanche were not a force to be taken lightly. What made the Great Raid so terrifying wasn't just the physical destruction it caused, but the message it sent. The Comanche had shown that they could organize large-scale coordinated attacks deep into settled territory, and that no town or settlement was truly safe from their reach. The raid also demonstrated the Comanche's ability to strike at the heart of their enemies, leaving an indelible mark on the psyche of the Texan settlers. In the aftermath of the raid, the Texas Rangers and the U.S. Army launched a series of retaliatory campaigns, but the damage had already been done. The Great Raid of 1840 remains one of the most significant and terrifying events in the history of the American West, a testament to the power and ferocity of the Comanche at the height of their dominance. The role of women in Comanche raids, while the focus of Comanche raids is often on the male warriors, it's important to note that women played a crucial role in these operations. Comanche women weren't involved in the fighting, but were essential in preparing for raids and dealing with the aftermath. They managed the camp while the men were away, ensuring the tribe's survival during prolonged campaigns. They also played a significant part in caring for the wounded and handling captives. Women were often responsible for integrating captives into the tribe, deciding whether they would be adopted, enslaved, or ransomed. For settlers, the thought of being handed over to Comanche women after a raid was terrifying in itself. While some captives were treated relatively well, others were subjected to harsh treatment and forced to work under brutal conditions or worse. This added another layer of fear to the already terrifying prospect of a raid. Raids as a way of life. Raiding wasn't just an occasional event for the Comanche. It was central to their economy and way of life. Unlike other tribes that focused on agriculture or trade, the Comanche depended heavily on the spoils of war. They raided for horses, supplies, and captives, which kept their society thriving. Horses, in particular, were a key target. A successful raid could capture hundreds of horses for personal mobility and trade with other tribes or settlers. The Comanche were horse-rich compared to other tribes, giving them a distinct advantage in warfare and trade negotiation. This constant cycle of raiding meant that the Comanche were always on the move, always planning the next attack. Their nomadic lifestyle made it difficult for settlers or the U.S. Army to track them down, adding to their mystique and making them seem even more elusive and dangerous. The Comanche and the U.S. Army as settlers pushed further west. The U.S. Army began to take a more active role in trying to subdue the Comanche. But this was no easy task. The Army's traditional tactics, which worked against other Native American tribes, were often ineffective against the Comanche. The Comanche's mobility made them incredibly difficult to pin down. They could retreat into the plains or mountains, regroup, and strike again. They also knew how to exploit the terrain to their advantage, using guerrilla tactics that kept the army on its toes. For soldiers stationed on the frontier, the threat of a Comanche raid was a constant source of fear and frustration. Even in heavily fortified forts were only partially safe. The Comanche could strike quickly and disappear before reinforcements arrived, leaving destruction in their wake. The collapse of the Comanche Empire, despite their fearsome reputation, the Comanche weren't invincible. By the late 1800s, a combination of factors weakened their power. The introduction of repeating rifles and more effective military strategies by the U.S. Army made it harder for the Comanche to fight back. Disease, particularly smallpox, also ravaged their population, decimating entire tribes. Additionally, the slaughter of the buffalo herds, which the Comanche relied on for food and supplies, forced them into a corner. Without their primary food source, they could no longer sustain their way of life through raiding. By the 1870s, the Comanche were forced onto reservations, marking the end of their dominance in the Great Plains. But the memory of their terrifying raids lived on, and even today, the stories of their exploits are remembered as some of the most fearsome in the history of the American West. Real-life accounts of Comanche raids to fully grasp the terror of the Comanche raids. We can look at some real-life accounts from settlers and soldiers who survived these attacks. One of the most famous examples comes from the story of Cynthia Ann Parker, a settler captured by the Comanche during a raid in 1836. She was only 9 years old at the time. She spent the next 24 years living with the Comanche, eventually fully integrated into their society. While her story has a tragic ending, she was forcibly rescued by Texas Rangers and spent the rest of her life longing to return to her Comanche family. It highlights the complexity of these raids. For many captives, the terror of being taken was only the beginning. The psychological toll of being torn from their families and forced to adapt to a completely different way of life was often unbearable. Another account comes from Colonel Ranald Mackenzie, a U.S. Army officer who led several campaigns against the Comanche. Mackenzie admitted that fighting the Comanche was unlike anything he had experienced before. Their speed, mobility, and ability to blend into the landscape made them a formidable enemy. These first-hand accounts give us a glimpse into the fear and uncertainty of living on the frontier during the height of Comanche's power. No one was safe, and the threat of a raid loomed over every settlement. The fear factor. Why it worked. The final puzzle is understanding why the Comanche raiding methods worked so well. It wasn't just about their brutality, speed, or skill with horses. It was about how they combined all these elements into a seamless strategy of fear. The Comanche knew that terrorizing their enemies could break their spirits before a single arrow was fired. They cultivated an image of themselves as unstoppable, savage, and relentless. And for their enemies, that image was enough to sow panic and disorganization. The fear of a Comanche raid was paralyzing. Settlers knew that if the Comanche attacked, their homes could be destroyed, their loved ones taken, and their lives forever changed. That fear was often enough to make communities abandon their homes altogether, leaving behind ghost towns in the wake of the Comanche's power. In the end, Comanche raids were terrifying, not just because of the violence or destruction they caused. They were terrifying because they represented the unknown. The Comanche were an enemy that couldn't be reasoned with, predicted, or outrun. Their mastery of warfare, combined with their deep understanding of psychological tactics, made them one of the most feared forces in the history of the American West. For the settlers who lived in constant fear of these raids, the terror was real, palpable, and ever-present. Even today, the legacy of the Comanche, as fearsome warriors, live on, a testament to their enduring place in American history. Thanks for watching. Please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more historical videos like this. We look forward to seeing you in our next video.